Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. It's snowing here, so if you hear a little noise, that's probably the snowflakes falling. Perfect time to read a nice cozy book. Recently, I've been reading some sermons given by St. John Vianney, and so if you've heard a few of them, you might be familiar with his style. So he was such a amazing saint. He converted so many people that the devil used to come at night and attack him physically. And it happened so frequently that he gave the devil a nickname. I can't really remember his name, but hey, how about we read his biography and we might hear the name. So this is The Cure of Ours, a biography by St. John Vianney by Francis Trochu. 1. A Soul Awakens. It was in the darkest day of 1794, the year of terror, just outside a small country town near Lyons called Dardley. In the Chantmerelle Valley, a green-clad fold between two hills, a band of children was playing. You may think there was little enough to inspire high spirits in children at a moment when every circumstance of life combined to distill sadness and desolation. Once the roads and the paths round Dardley had been dotted with crucifixes erected by the devout of bygone days. Today they lay rotting in the grass, cast down by the order of the revolutionary boss of Lyons, the famous Fouché. The shut and silent church was without priest, without mass. The lamp had ceased to burn in the desecrated sanctuary. The bell sounded no more. All the same, these children were happy. After they had sung and shouted their way all down the undistinguished rivulet called the Planches, which winds along the bottom of the Chantmerelle Valley, amid irises, watercress, and wild mint, the children suddenly fell silent. They had sat down round a grassy knoll, where one of them had taken his stand, as if he had been about to make a speech to them. And indeed, the little boy was barely 8 years old. He had begun to preach to his playmates. Preaching is a strictly accurate word, for he was repeating to his companions phrases from the Gospel scripture stories, which were purely and simply scraps of sermons. It would be a natural assumption that little Jean-Marie Vianney, for that was his name, had learned these things at his catechism. It would be a wrong one, however, for as long ago as 1791, the Abbé Ray, the cure of Dardley, had refused to take the sacrilegious oath to the civil power, which was exacted under the new church constitution the revolutionaries had voted, and had taken refuge in Italy. All Jean-Marie knew of the circumstances was what he had learned from his mother, or from his elder sister Catherine. Under cover of night, though he had accompanied his parents to the barns, often a long tramp away where the priests, who had to disguise themselves as if they were criminals, could still celebrate a secret mass. He had listened with his ears wide open to those confessors of the faith who risked death every day in order to administer the sacraments or give religious instructions to France's persecuted Catholics. He had listened, and he had absorbed. Whereas some children display from their earliest years a passion for music and others of thirst for mechanical knowledge, Jean-Marie had manifested from the very first a passion for God. That passion he translated into terms dictated by his own knowledge and the nature of his audience. One of his child companions said long afterwards that the principal theme on which the little Vianney preached was the obedience a child owes its parents. He also urged his listeners, most of whom had already started work as shepherds or cowherds, not to lose their temper or quarrel among themselves, not to use coarse language, and above all, never to blaspheme. The miniature sermons could have been one of two things, embarrassingly priggish or really moving. Children are instant to detect a prig among themselves, and the best tribute to the genuineness of the feeling Jean-Marie communicated is that though his audience included boys 4 or 5 years older than himself, and though he constantly used the phrase "my children" to them, no one ever dreamed of laughing. Miniature, of course, these sermons had to be, for the children were all itching to be on the move in some new game. But Jean-Marie's imagination was equal to that. He had a talent for transforming games into simple-minded religious ceremonies, and getting his companions to enjoy them too. He would make a processional cross out of a couple of small branches, distribute wild flowers to the younger members of the party, and form the older into 2 choirs, and the procession would gravely move off down some aisle of elders or willows. It was almost always I who took the cure. Jean-Marie Vianney was to say long after. When he had become a curé in earnest, his hands joined, serious and concentrated. He would wind up the procession, reciting his rosary or lifting his voice with the rest in some popular hymn. An altar of repose had been arranged in the hollow of an old willow. On its cloth of green moss, embowered in branches and flowers, was a statuette of Our Lady. That belonged to Jean-Marie. Indeed, it was the only treasure he had. It had been a present from his mother, and he always carried it on him. The whole band fell on their knees before the unpretentious altar, and the celebrant began the Pater and the Ave, which the congregation took up from him. Next moment the children were back at their games with as much an energy as ever. If you had looked for young Vianney in the village at that time, you would perhaps have been quite as likely to find him praying as playing. But he was a perfectly happy and high-spirited boy, and never said no when his contemporaries asked him to join in a game. One of them, indeed, André Provine, remembers that he was very good at games and always won at it, but he showed no sign of side. He would pick up his winnings, for the children played for halfpence, and then, looking at the long face of the loser, would hand them back, saying with a smile of gentle malice, "Well, you shouldn't have started me playing." The band of children was breaking up now. Those of them with jobs were returning to watch over their animals. They had listened perfectly seriously to Jean-Marie, who told them only to use the stick when it was necessary and never out of temper, and had not dreamed of disputing when he assured them that temper was a sin. Left to himself, the child, with an occasional eye for the herd of cows and of sheep he was looking after, would either return to his prayers or, for he was clever with his hands, set to work making little devotional objects from the clay he scooped up out of the bed of the stream. Some of them were statuettes of the saints, some of them little chapels, and occasionally he would bring them back to the house, where his father would fire them in the oven. His sister Marguerite said that a Virgin, modeled by Jean-Marie, was preserved for years at the Vianney farm. It was no common upbringing that had given the child his deep sense of religion and his extraordinary influence over his companions. Dedicated to the Blessed Virgin before his birth, baptized the day he entered the world, May 8, 1786, Jean-Marie Vianney, fourth child of Matthew Vianney and his wife Marie, had been his mother's favorite from the first, and she had thrown herself into training his heart and his mind as if she had a premonition of the high calling that awaited him. He was barely 12 months old when, guiding his tiny hand, she helped him make the sign of the cross before she gave him his food. The child learned the lesson so well that he would refuse to eat or drink until this had been done. He was a little older when he insisted on joining the farmly group that recited evening prayers together before the open hearth. He would not have gone to sleep in his mother if his mother had not bent down over his pillow to kiss him good night and to commend him to his guardian angel. From an early age, he liked to be told stories of God and his servants, especially those from the Bible, which his big sister Catherine knew by heart and repeated so vividly. His mother, too, would spare every moment she could from the cooking and the housework to instruct him. She talked to him of God and of the wicked who did not love him. She taught him his prayers and explained to him the mysteries of the life of our Lord. Bright-eyed and attentive, the child easily absorbed everything. Indeed, he already grasped the meaning of the faith well enough to realize that the truths of religion have got to be lived and practiced. Marguerite, the youngest of his sisters, tells the story of how, when he was about 4, Jean Marie disappeared from the house one afternoon, and for some time his mother, more and more worried, searched for him in vain. There was a moment when her heart stopped at the thought that he might have fallen into the deep pond where the cattle came to drink. In the end, taking a closer look at the stable, she saw to her amazement the little boy kneeling in a dark corner there, lost in prayer before his statuette of the Virgin, which he was holding up in front of him in his clasped hands. 4-year-old Jean Marie had already discovered the joys of prayer, and in order to taste them the better, he had sought out a place where he could be alone. At the age of 5, he was getting up from his cot like a man to accompany his mother to early Mass. Only too soon the parish church was shut by the wicked his mother had told him about. When they had driven the faithful priest into exile, Jean Marie was no less stout-hearted in accompanying his parents to those mysterious hideouts, known to good Christians, where the Mass was still celebrated. Francois and Catherine, his elder brother and sister, would sometimes complain of the length of the walk. Try and be like Jean Marie, their mother would tell them. There's an example for you. It was there in the barn, where a few smoky candles dispensed a wavering light, that the future saint came to understand the necessity of the priesthood and its unspeakable greatness. The little boy of 7 was seeing for himself these men of God who lived for only one idea, the salvation of souls. The priest who lifted his hands in the familiar ceremonial was a hunted man, hunted by the enemies of the Catholic religion, and he had dared 1,000 dangers to get to this lost corner of Lyon's countryside. The faces in the flickering shadows shone with an incredulous joy. Men and women altered between smiles and unashamed tears as they found themselves once more at the foot of the altar. It was only a makeshift altar, a table or a chest of drawers carried in from the neighbor's farm, on which loving hands had laid the whitest cloth they could find. Clasped to his mother's side, Jean Marie watched the priest, the deep lines on whose face bespoke his night watches and his weariness. Sometimes the Vianney's own home had the honor of sheltering one of these outlaws. The house stood on the outskirts of the village, and it had a number of outbuildings where it was easy to hide the sacred vessels. Mass was therefore said at night in the living room of the farm. Chapter 2. First Communion. It was after a Mass celebrated at night in his parents' home that Jean-Marie Vianney made his first confession. The Abbé Grosbois, who at the beginning of the Revolution had been an assistant priest at St. Crux in Lyons, was traveling round in disguise in the outskirts of the city. His usual headquarters was at Écully, but he often visited the neighboring parish of Dardilly. When he came to the Vianneys one day in 1797, he noticed how attentively Jean Marie was looking at him. He wanted to have a private talk to this child, whose frank and open looks attracted him. "How old are you?" he asked the boy. 11. "Tell me, how long is it since you last confessed?" But I haven't confessed yet, replied Jean-Marie, opening his eyes wide. Very well, my child. Let's do it right away. The Abbe Grobos took the little Vianney to the foot of the grandfather clock, whose great copper pendulum dismissed the seconds sonorously with its solemn swing and returned. But the young penitent, his eyes lowered, had no thoughts except for the priest, to whom he was revealing his soul, and who was no less impressed than astonished by the things he heard. As soon as it was over, the Abbé took Matthew Vianney and his wife aside. Do you know what a treasure of a child you've got? He said. He's already grasped all the essential ideas of the faith. All that's necessary is to give him a bit more religious instruction. Why, Abbé, that's just what we feel. Unfortunately, what with all the work on the farm. Don't worry. Haven't you got relations in the parish of Eclé? Yes, replied Marie Vianney. There's one of my sisters who married Francois Humbert, who lives at the Pont de Jour. Just as I thought. I found some good folk in the Eclé who are willing to prepare the local children in secret for their first communion. Send Jean-Marie to his uncle's and leave the rest to me. Monsieur and Madame Vianney promised, but all the same they waited a little before sending the child to Eclé. First of all, it was winter. Then they felt it would be a good thing if the boy had a few more months at school. The Dardley School, which had been run up to 1791 by a Christian teacher, had shut down then. A new teacher, Citizen Dumas, had reopened it 4 years later, and Jean-Marie had just about learned to read and write. Intelligent and wide awake he was. He would have forged ahead rapidly in less troubled times. Unfortunately, the 2 previous years, in 1795 and 1796, when he was 9 and 10, he had only been to school in the winter, when the beets were safely in the byres and his job as a cowherd made no calls on him. He therefore took lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic for another 6 months. Finally, in April or May 1798, Marie Vianney took her son to the Humberts. The good folk of whom the Abbé Grobos had spoken were 2 nuns of the Order of St. Charles, whom the Revolution had driven out of their convent, and who, wearing lay clothes now, continued their work for the souls of children, at the risk of their lives. Under the very nose of Lyon's Vigilance Committee, whose agents often went on their tour in the countryside, they had found means of collecting round them some 15 or so children, and held catechism classes both for boys and girls. On the introduction of the Abbé Grobos, the nuns welcomed Jean-Marie Vianney joyfully, and his immediate preparation for the great day lasted just over a year. It is too often thought that the execution of the fanatical Robespierre, 9 Thermidor of the year, 2 July 27, 1794, put an end to religious persecution in France and ended the whole reign of terror. There was indeed a lull in it. Blood ceased to flow and Catholics started to breathe again. But this relative peace did not last long. The free Masonic lodges, which had been the inspiration of the whole onslaught against Catholicism, resumed their unholy work by less direct means. Having failed to stamp out religious faith in France, they set about trying to substitute other creeds, no matter how jejune and half-baked, for the religion of Jesus Christ. As Théophanie stepped into the shoes of Theotrophanie, the government of the Directory tried to introduce the Decadal religion under the new calendar on which it was based. The day of the rest fell every 10 days. Men must halt their labors not on Sunday, but on Decade, if they were to obey the law of 14 Germinal of the year, April 4th, 1798. On certain decadal feasts, townspeople were to gather round graybeards and hear them laud. The wonders of the Revolution in country villages, the farmer was to assemble round the still humid vat or the toilsome wine-press, the active and faithful cohorts who had helped them ravish from the hillsides their most glittering spoils. That at last was how the official programs put it, with the orotund verbiage proper to Latin revolutionary orators. It was as wearisome as the rain, as empty as the void. The people, particularly the country people, greeted these buffooneries with the contempt they deserved. In the Lyons area, the peasants continued to observe Sunday on a day as a day of rest, and Jean-Marie Vianney's father never failed to do so. Naturally, the Directory hit back at the defaulters, and the severity of its punishment progressively increased, but it was principally against the leadership of the church that these blows were aimed. Just about the time that General Berthier, on February 10, 1798, was seizing Rome and snatching from the Vatican the octogenarian Pius VI, whom the Directory allowed to die in exile, a parishioner in the citadel of Valence, nearly 300 French priests were being deported to Guiana. 1,200 others were flung into the convict prison of Ré or of Orléans, while the main body of the clergy, whether they had never left their country or had returned to it from exile, were ordered to leave France without delay. Such was the atmosphere of the period, which historians have understandably christened the Little Terror or the Second Terror. All this did not prevent the Abbé Grobos from staying on in his parish at Éclès. He had already been through the ordeal of deportation for refusing to take the schismatic oath to the Constitutional Church. He had returned from Italy, risking death to do so. As soon as he had been able to make his way across the Alps, today he lived only for his flock. He was determined that the First Communion ceremony should be carried out with the most impressive possible solemnity, and the date he had chosen for it fell in the period when the days are longest, the time of the hay harvest. So very early in the morning, one day towards the end of June 1799, a series of little groups, who appeared to show not the slightest interest in each other, gathered at Éclès in the home of Madame de Pignon, mother-in-law of the famous Claude de Joffre, who co-inventor of the steamboat. A big room on the ground floor had been decked out for the ceremony. There had been some fear that the light of the candles might filter out into the street through the closed shutters. So the Abbé Grobos had asked the borrowers, loaded with hay, should be placed in front of the high windows. Thanks to these precautions, the moving occasion went off without a shadow of interface. For the authorities, as in the day before the persecution, the days of tranquil festivals in churches laden with scents of flowers and of incense, the little girls were wearing their white veils, the boys their white brassards. The boys and girls communicants alike held candles in their hands. The sentiments of love and devotion which filled Jean-Marie Vianney as he received his God can be imagined from the account given by his sister, Marguerite, his junior by a year. She says that her brother was so happy that he did not want to leave the room where he had had the joy of communicating for the first time. To the end of his life, he preserved as a treasure his simple little communicant's rosary. From that moment on, Jean-Marie was no longer treated as a child. He may not have looked big, but he was more than 13. There was nothing wrong with his health either, though he was a little small for his age. The evening of his first communion, his parents took him back with him to Dardley. He was to have no more time for reading now, much though he loved it. The next morning he got up in working clothes and went out with his father and his elder brother Francois into the fields. Chapter 3. Vocation. At long last a ray of hope had brightened the horizon of France, darkened for 10 years by the clouds of terror and hate. Entering the city of Milan as a conqueror, Napoleon Bonaparte, then First Consul, had uttered words of peace that promised well for his Catholic countrymen, and all through the year of 1800, a stream of priests who had remained faithful to their vocation, and whom the revolutionary decrees had exiled, was pouring back into the parishes. Boldly the Abbé Grosbeaux and a companion from the underground apostolate, Charles Bailly, a former monk, reopened the church at Éclès, and after a rapid restoration of the building, began to celebrate the office openly once more. It was there first of all that Jean-Marie and his parents returned to their singular Sunday Mass in the spring of 1802. Thanks to the Concordat, the former cure of Dardley, the Abbé Ray officially resumed possession of his presbytery. The very year the annual Corpus Christi procession started up again in the parish, and Jean-Marie, immensely proud at being accepted as one of the volunteer assistants, helped to set up mass crowd with oriflammes and arranged festoons of leaves and of flowers. The changed atmosphere gave the young man, who was just turning 16, twice the energy for his work. Merely to hear the Angelus calling to mind across the quiet fields those thoughts of the faith that the Revolution had sought so relentlessly to proscribe, filled his heart with joy. He knelt down where he was and recited the 3 Hail Marys with hands clasped, then returned to his job. Since he was still unconscious of his true vocation, he had exactly the same work day as his father and his brother. There were the fields to be plowed, the vines to be hoed, the hay or the corn to be got in. Everything he did was done quietly and deliberately, with no bustle and no loitering. You would have said he was entirely taken up with his job. Indeed, he did give himself up to it, for it was his duty. But his thoughts rose above it to the Father in heaven, whose invisible presence he could feel. A glimpse of his vision of life in those early days as a farm laborer is given to a passage that came from him much later, on the happiness of the man who associates with God with all his activities. If you are working with God, the cure says, it may be you who will be doing the work, but God will be blessing it. You will be walking, but He will be blessing your steps. There are people who make the best of everything this way, even the winter. It's cold, so they offer God their shivers. What a wonderful thing it is to offer oneself every morning to God as a sacrifice. Jean-Marie, in fact, never lost sight of his soul, but that did not mean he was a glum or melancholy companion. It is true he was not attracted by noisy games or knockabout fun, loose talk and doubtful company. He shunned. But in the family circle or with friends such as Fleury, Verixel, Françoise Dussols, and André Pauvin, who were to stay on at Dardley as honest farmers, with Jean Domond, who was one day to be a brother at the Christian schools, the young Vianney relaxed as easily as anyone. All the same, his laughter was never boisterous. He seemed to prefer silence to the happiness of conversation and solitude to the best of company, for he needed peace and withdrew in order to be able to talk with God. He had never ceased to regard the shortness of his time at school, and he did his best to add to his knowledge by solitary study. On Sundays he would shut himself up to read, either in the garden or in the corner of the stables, where he had installed his room a little cubicle separated by a plank partition from the animal stalls. He had fixed a shelf on the wall to hold his favorite books. He was devoted above all to the Gospels and to the imitation of Christ. In the evenings, again, he would read himself to sleep. It was then he tried to pass on his workaday companions the lessons his readings had taught him that the shock came. Quite a lot of them seemed never to have heard of the most elementary truths of the faith. Motherless children, young shepherds, little servants, whom no one had ever worried to look at. Fathers' sons suffered like their fathers with the fashionable ideas of the time, were all alike in one thing. They had never been to catechism. Jean-Marie looked back on the days when he had preached to his fellow children in the Sainte Marie Valley, but no mere childish homilies would have answered the needs of his comrades of today. Their bewilderment and ignorance called for serious teaching, for the eloquence of a priest, if only there could be more priests for these souls in the twilight. And so little by little an idea that had probably been born as a vague and timid dream amid his thoughts as a child began to haunt Jean-Marie Vianney. The church in France was clamoring for more priests. Well, why should not he answer the call? The reason was all too clear. What was he, after all, but a little poor peasant with dreams above his situation? Did he begin to sound like common sense? He wants to become a priest at 17, when all the education he had received had been 1 year at school? Even were the idea less comical, where should he go for his education? Were there still seminaries in existence today? There was, of course, the Abbé Ray, the cure of Dardley, but he was a sick man. The years of exile had been too much for him. He had talked of resigning, and people said he was going to retire to Lyons. That was not all either. Jean-Marie must have told himself. Would his father listen to his request for a moment? Education cost money, and his father had had enough fuss already about the money he had to spend on the dowry of Catherine, his eldest daughter, now a married woman at Ecley, and even more about the sums he had paid on purchasing release from conscript service for Francois, whose labor was necessary for the farm. Jean-Marie knew that his pair of hands was no less essential. What was to be done? Instinctively, the boy confided his secret to his mother, and she understood him at once. "I'd always thought it when I saw you at your prayers, dear," she said. "Yes, it's God who's calling you. But how are you going to be able to answer?" It was her constant encouragement that for 2 long years sustained the resolution of the son who without her might never have become a priest, and one of the holiest among priests. In the end, his father gave in. It remained to find a priest who would agree to take charge of the young man. At this very moment the news reached the Vienney's farm that the Abbé Bailly, who had helped the Abbé Grobos reopen the church of Ecley, had been appointed curé there, and that his first thought, once he had settled into his presbytery, had been to set up a school where he taught the Latin himself. Although several children from Lyons itself, in particular the little Laurasals, whose father had been guillotined for his faith during the Revolution, were attending the curé's school. Jean-Marie did not feel at ease till his mother had gone to see the Abbé Bailly. The abbé was none too keen to take an extra pupil, particularly one who was so old, who had had so little schooling. But as soon as he had seen the boy, for he insisted that he should be brought along to see him, he was won over at once. "If it's this lad," he said, "I'll take him on right away." So the young man came back to live at Ecley at the home of the Humberts. But it was a changed being whom his uncle and aunt took in this time. There was no trace of the engaging child who 6 years before had been the life and soul of their household. Before them was a young man with the face of an ascetic, behind which was an easy guess, the disciplined will concentrated on a lofty objective, which he trembled to think he might not be able to attain. It was at this period that Jean Marie, to stir the divine compassion, began to practice some at least of the mortifications which were to make him a new desert father in the heart of the 19th century. A plate of soup without any salt or seasoning was all he ate at midday and at supper. For his schoolwork was going to be such a crushing burden. The Abbe Bailly's first pupils were children of 11 or 12. They were naturally gifted. They had already been taught in their families, and they seemed to absorb everything without effort. The very same lessons they sailed through so easily had Jean Marie on the rack. He would think he had learned everything, only to find that his memory, which had been unemployed too long, had retained nothing at all. The weeks passed by and became months, and he made almost no progress. The young man might try, for politeness' sake, to put a smiling face on it all, but at last his heart was bitterly unhappy. In the worst moments, the image of his father's farm, of the fields around it, would invade his mind irresistibly, full of pathos of reproach. Why did you leave it all? He would seem to hear the silent voices say, farm work didn't give you this sort of trouble at Dardley. Come back to us. In the end, there happened what the Abbe Bailly had most feared. Jean Marie came to him one day and told him, I want to go home. The Abbe Bailly might appear distant and severe, but for a long time he had guessed and understood everything, and he made a supreme effort to compose his awkward pupil. But what do you want to do, my dear child? He said. You'll only be going to meet unhappiness halfway. You know your father wants nothing better than to have you on the farm. Then he sees you in such low spirits, he'll keep you at the house. And if he does that, it's goodbye to all your dreams, Jean Marie. Goodbye to the priesthood, goodbye to the cares of souls. The Abbe Bailly had hit on the sensitive point. The 20-year-old schoolboy stayed on at Ecloo. Nevertheless, since he did not dare to hope anything more of his horrible head, he called his memory, he flung himself even more passionately into prayer. Before going back to class, he took a vow to go on foot, begging his bread, to the faraway church of La Lavosec, where are preserved the bones of Saint Francois Regis, who died of exhaustion in his parish of the Vivarais countryside on December 31st, 1640. There he would ask the intercession of his great missionary for the grace to attain the priesthood. Though he made his pilgrimage under a kindly sky, it was the spring of 1806. Jean-Marie Vianney found it a painful experience. He looked able-bodied. His clothes were clean and neat. He was old enough and strong enough to be at work. Everywhere the doors at which he begged for charity of a bit of bread were shut in his face. He had to live, till he reached Lavosec, on practically nothing but the roots he dug up in the fields. It was no wonder that the confessor before whom he knelt at the shrine advised him to fulfill his vow on the return journey in another way, to give, that is to say, instead of asking. Jean Marie, who had learned from his hard experience, did not protest, but an immense compassion filled him, feeling for the poor as he already did, at the thought of the thousands of beggars who were tramping the roads of France without a place to lay their heads. The young pilgrim prayed a long time before the reliquary in Walnut, where the relics of the canonized Jesuit could then be venerated. Then, his soul at peace, he took the road for Lyons once more. From that moment on, declared someone who knew him well, he made enough headway not to lose heart any more. That was all that either he or his master had hoped for, indifferent as they both were to the mere outward show of success. It was in the following year that Jean-Marie Vianney, on the eve of his 21st birthday, received the sacrament of confirmation at the hands of Cardinal Frasche, Archbishop of Lyons and uncle of the Emperor Napoleon I. From that day on, the Abbé Bailly's pupil added to the names he had received at his baptism that of Baptiste. He already had a special devotion to the holy precursor. And we'll get back to the rest next Sunday. Hope you've enjoyed it so far. And if you've got snow outside, go out and enjoy it.